Gresham College presents The City Livery Companies by Professor Tim Connell.
Yes, it's interesting that the livery companies turn out to be quite such a subject of interest for people, because I think it's fair to say if the livery companies didn't exist, then nobody would actually set out to invent them. Over the centuries, and we're talking quite possibly over more than 1,000 years back into Saxon times, they've nearly faded out of existence of their own accord as the city and the trades have changed. They've been threatened by successive governments. They've been persuaded by unscrupulous penny-pinching monarchs, one or two I shall name and shame, to buy their own charters back. I won't say that too loudly in case the government streams that one up as a way of sorting out the present problems. But that, the other thing is, of course, that people quite often, let's have some pictures, look on them as some kind of anachronistic dining club where a few old city buffers meet for a glass of port and to talk about the good old times before Big Bang. Now, that doesn't explain the rate at which new companies are forming and guilds are moving towards the livery. Anything ranging from the world traders who took livery at the turn of the millennium, through to, hands up now, how many of you have heard of the agricultural journalists? One, well done indeed. They are actually the latest. I bumped into somebody at the United Guild Service who was from the agricultural journalists, and of course we have to make mention of the Guild of Educators who are moving happily towards livery themselves. Now, this may be because when you are a long-standing and ancient organisation, what you have to do is to reinvent yourself at regular intervals. I was at one wonderful meeting where somebody said, perhaps we could start a tradition. And you think about this, and of course, if you don't put the starting date into your documentation, within 5 years, somebody on the committee will claim that you can't touch it because we've been doing it for at least a century. And I was at a heated debate, in fact, yesterday at a company which I shan't name, but which by sheer coincidence will turn up in the pictures. And a wonderful man called John Norton left money for cakes and ale in approximately 1611. Now, the trouble is that 200 groats in 1611 doesn't go too far when you think of the price of beer today. And there was a suggestion that people should actually pay to come along to the cakes and ale event. And the response was absolutely magnetic. If John Norton left money for cakes and ale, then by Jove, we were going to have cakes and ale. And long may the tradition continue. I then stuck my oar in and said, well, perhaps what we could do is to top up the fund and not tell anybody, and then actually it's not quite such a problem. The other thing, of course, is that quite a lot of companies have reinvented what it is they actually do. And the example I like are the horners. Horn was the cheapo substance of previous ages and took the role that plastic would do today. So the horners support the plastics industry. And then, of course, you have the modern companies, I will say with bated breath, the tax advisors, the security professionals, who are very recent and very welcome when you think of the security issues in the modern world, and the hackney cab drivers, who are not, of course, the carmen. And, of course, lots of people join these companies, and if they didn't, then they wouldn't exist. There'd be no reason for them. And you ask someone who is involved in one of the companies, and the kind of glazed expression comes into their eyes, like, what a damn stupid question, and why do we exist? Of course we exist. And I do have to say quite critically that we are almost victims of our own success in the livery companies, because when you actually list all the things that a livery company does, not one of the great 12, any one of the 109 I think we're up to now, you're looking at everything from almshouses to support for the armed forces, for bursaries for students, support for particular industries. And we really don't make as much noise about this as I think we ought to. And I believe the new Lord Mayor is talking about rehabilitating the good name of the City of London. And I do think the success stories which emanate from the livery companies should be right up there at the top. So they're a fascinating aspect of public life. Good, I've got onto page 2. Important part of the work of the City of London, as I shall be explaining constitutionally, links directly to the election of the sheriff and the Lord Mayor. Elections of the sheriff post, once considered to be pretty much automatic as sinecure and an excuse to come up for lunch, and actually now quite often contested with several candidates. The halls, here I am standing in front of the picture, the hall's old and new. We have a hall to the left from 1843 and a hall to the right, which is obviously one of the very modern ones. 43 halls today. Some were lost in the Blitz, 30 went in the Blitz in fact, some were rebuilt, others not. And companies like the Carpenters, the Glaziers and the Salters have quite deliberately gone for a modern style. You don't necessarily have to be totally traditional in your environment, and when you're looking for somewhere to book, do bear in mind that there is a huge range in terms of what is actually on offer. Now, we do talk very much about livery companies and the square mile, but I'm quite intrigued to find that guilds have survived in all parts of the United Kingdom, in places as far apart as Chester, Newcastle and Dundee. And I noticed when browsing through something the other day that in Canterbury in the 16th century, a member of the Shoemakers Guild by the name of John Marlowe became a freeman of the city, and this entitled his son Christopher to go to King's School. And Archbishop Parker, quite a famous man at the time, endowed scholarships for students from King's School to go to Corpus Christi, Cambridge. So one could argue that without the Shoemakers Guild in Canterbury, Christopher Marlowe would never have had the education which led him to be a playwright. Now, some city guilds, like the bakers for example, maintain links with livery companies and guilds abroad. Places like Bern, Cologne, Düsseldorf and Zurich would be cases in point. Here we have a nice illustration from Chartres Cathedral where you have the farriers. Somebody there is shoeing a horse, and this is by no means the only occupation of the time related to guilds, which you'll find in the wonderful stained glass down in Chartres. And of course in Spain you have the cofradías and the hermandades, slightly different in aim, but Seville is by no means the only place to have those amazing parades at Easter, and again they are linked in many ways to charitable works. We have the blood transfusion service, for example, in this country, and in Spain you would belong to a brotherhood, an hermandad, and that would be the way in which you would do your donating. Over in the New World, down in Buenos Aires, rather nice, they have a guild of hammermen, like they do in Glasgow, which is for anybody who uses a hammer as part of their work. And the Argentinians have taken this interpretation slightly further, and that includes auctioneers. It's rather a nice touch. So good for the arts is all I can say. Now, the link between the livery companies and local government in the form of the Corporation of the City of London is, I think, unique, and again, a particularly important part of what it is that we do. The concept of a trade guild, I think, is well known and understood. As I've mentioned, a number of companies believe that their activities in the city go back to before the Norman conquest. When William arrived, he got crowned with what some would consider to be indecent haste in Westminster Abbey, but of course that's the other city in London. I don't think he'd have got quite the same reputation response in the square mile, but of course he did agree to respect the rights and the ancient laws of the area. So in fact we might well argue, and I don't know whether documentation goes back that far, but a lot of these working guilds go back to before the conquest. Certainly you can find documents from the 13th century which refer to customs of ancient time, or as before, as previously, etc. The Stationers' Company, for example, appears as early as 1403. But curiously enough, this is some bloke trying to get out of jury duty on the grounds that he's literate and therefore might have previously read some of the documents relating to the case, which is not perhaps a strong argument in terms of saying this was a large and socially responsible organisation. These organisations, of course, regulated trades. Our phrase, the baker's dozen, comes back to the question of not providing loaves underweight, so chucking an extra one just in case. The masterpiece was the piece provided by the apprentice to show that he actually did know what he was doing. I'm all in favour of apprenticeships. We'll come on to those towards the end of the lecture. And of course, we do tend to think of men as belonging to liveries, but in the 15th century, I beg your pardon, the 14th, only just discovered this, only 5 out of 500 guilds refused to accept women. And there were plenty of trades where they had skills and they had the connections and they had the knowledge which made them valuable members of the organisation, though it has to be said they weren't allowed to take the part of any officers inside the company. The lady I always like to mention is the redoubtable Elizabeth Pickering Jackson Redman Chumley. Between the 1530s and the 1540s, she married no fewer than 3 stationers, though not all at the same time, because, of course, we overlook the economic value of widows, because, of course, the lady inherited her husband's business. She was therefore a good economic bet, and I'm sure she was a charming woman, and therefore the lads were queuing up to get married to her because this gave them the economic security to continue with the trade. The nice thing about Mrs. Chumley is that, in fact, she went on to become a printer in her own right. So it shows that it could be done, and even if practice changed as the centuries went by. Talking of which, we get to the 16th century, and population growth becomes critical. In 1509, when Henry VIII is born, the city numbers about 50,000 people. By the time Elizabeth comes to the throne, 1558, about 90,000. By the time of her death in 1603, London had reached a massive 250,000, which incidentally is still smaller than the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which at the time was about 3 times that size. Many people, of course, have been dispossessed in Elizabethan times by the enclosures. We have the phenomenon of the sturdy beggar. Large numbers of people have been displaced and tend to drift towards the larger cities. And we also need to take into account the flow of refugees. This is by no means a modern phenomenon, especially from the Protestant communities of the lowlands and the Huguenots in France, who, of course, do bring particular skills and trades with them. The Huguenots particularly well known for skills ranging from silk weaving through to glass making. And in fact, Henry VIII made himself very unpopular with the glaziers because when he was building one of his many palaces, he contracted with the Flemish glaziers to do the glass and not the local company, and they were rather upset about it at the time. Of course, as the city expanded beyond its boundaries, there was a suggestion that the livery companies should extend their rights and responsibilities to the rapidly growing city. There was opposition to this. It's known as the Great Refusal of the 1630s. Did they miss an opportunity? Could the London County Council of blessed memory actually have been set up in the 1630s? Might it even have averted a civil war? Perhaps everyone would have been very happy with the new arrangement. When we look at the contentious issue as to how to govern London right up to the present day, I rather suspect it might have started a civil war of its own. Now, this does mean, however, that it had to be recognised that the companies, which were very restrictive in style, the stationers had the right to smash up any unregulated printing press in England, which they did. A lot of companies had the right not only to inspect, but to control the production of the goods in their particular company, which I think today we would look on as a restrictive practice. As against that, there was the question of quality control, as we look on it today. There was the question of the protecting prices, protecting employment, and in terms of the context of employment as today, the very important issue of training and bringing apprentices up through the system. Now, the 16th century, important again because England, particularly London, isn't the sort of economic powerhouse which we tend to think of it, I trust, up until this day. I hope that the presidents of France and Germany are listening to this particular lecture. And it's only really when Antwerp is destroyed as a trade centre, it's sacked by the Spanish army in 1576. It's an episode known as the Spanish Fury, which has the effect of really making it impossible as an international trading place, an international marketplace. There on the left we have the Antwerp Exchange. It looks like it's a bit lost in the fog of time there, but never mind. On the right-hand side we have our very own Royal Exchange. More correctly, of course, Gresham's Exchange, because our very own Sir Thomas Gresham, who was a factor in Antwerp, Elizabeth I's financial advisor, gun runner, smuggler, and Elizabethan extraordinary, kind of bloke we need today, really. He saw the opportunity to divert trade away from Antwerp and into London. He was, of course, an eminent member of the Mercers Company, and the mercers were in the forefront of much of this trade. If you walk up the staircase at Mercer's Hall, you'll see a portrait of Sir Lionel Duckett, Lord Mayor in 1572, and someone who was involved in the Elizabethan voyages. These were, we tend to think, purely geographical in scope, you know, kind of sponsored by Thomas Cook as kind of future opportunities for things like tourism. But of course, Sir John Hawkins and his dad started the English end of the slave trade, perhaps to their discredit. But some of these voyages could be so profitable that they drew the attention of the merchant venturers and other investors. Those in Bristol, of course, were particularly prominent. And this led to the development of what we call the Black Triangle, that manufactured goods go from England down to the west coast of Africa. They are traded for slaves. The slaves are then transported via the infamous Middle Passage across to the Caribbean. There they produce economically valuable things like sugar and cotton. Those in turn go back, high investment, high value, plenty of cash. That goes into the production of more manufactured goods, and so the whole thing goes on into the 19th century. But West Africa and the Caribbean, go down to the Thames and see the replica of the Golden Hind. That was quite a large ship for the period. There are trading ventures that go as far as the Levant, though that's fairly sewn up by the Venetians and the Turks, and you, I think at the time you offended them at your peril, though an awful lot of ships actually traded quite regularly with ports in Spain, not just the north coast. Don't know if you remember, there used to be a soap they used to sell in Boots called Knight's Castile, which is a white soap. And this was because the Castilians, as early as the 14th century, had found out how to make soap a nice white colour rather than the nasty grey stuff that you get out of goose fat, which was the local alternative. And Chaucer's shipman is already bringing sherry, as well as Bordeaux and other fine French wines, into England. And even in a little trading port like Whitstable down in Kent, which is now called a heritage coastal town. And when I was brought out there, we used to call it a dump. And a little port like Whitstable had 200 ships trading out of it. And these guys used to sail, these boats, they sort of used to do a kind of a half-yearly thing, going around as far as Valencia for oranges, nuts. They go further east for things like dates and figs. And one enterprising lot actually converted a ship specially to carry pineapples. Now, I met a very old sailor once down in Whitstable Harbour, and he was telling us yarns about a place called Iquique. And I worked out this was actually Iquique on the coast of Chile, and he'd actually, as a young man, been involved in the night trade. At one time in the 19th century, there were 700 British merchant vessels involved along that coast. And then I thought perhaps he meant Waikiki. And I think he might have done, because there were actually 2-masted sailing boats that went from East Kent as far as Hawaii for pineapples and came back again. The trouble is most of the crew were dead of scurvy by the time they got home, so of course then the pineapples had probably gone off anyway. So this means that as far as the city is concerned, there are enormous trading opportunities. And this link between the financiers of the city and the navigators of the period, extremely important in developing a wide range of things, from international trade, London is the heart of international trade as we have today, through to the slave trade, which of course goes on for several hundred years. The only thing is, of course, that the Civil War and the Great Fire between them tend to change things, and no more so really than James I and Charles II I shall name and shame, because they spent a lot of their time trying to screw money out of the livery companies. Those of you who've approached the livery companies for money these days will also find they're quite reticent about the way in which they give away their money. Charles II, however, threatened all sorts of nasty things if people didn't buy back their charters. And of course, after the Civil War and the Great Fire, a lot of companies no longer had the actual charter extant, and so he could claim they didn't have one, and this cost them all quite a lot of money. I must also mention again a rather splendid fellow. The clerks of livery companies are a breed in their own right, and this one was no exception. The Great Fire was approaching Stationers' Hall at enormous speed, and he brought his hand cart from his home in Clerkenwell and had a choice between saving the company silver and saving the company archives. To his enormous credit, he saved the archives, which we're now in the process of digitising and will probably be worth far more than the silver by the time we get it on the open market. So good for him is all I can say. Now, I suppose you could argue that Charles II and James I were really just trying to update something which they thought even by the 1680s was kind of a little kind of passé. In the 19th century, there are serious attempts not only to reorganise the livery companies, but also the management governance of the City of London. There are a number of commissions, some very, very good books in the Guildhall Library and, of course, in the bookshop, much to be recommended just before Christmas, about the ways in which, given the extent to which London had expanded, and there was this city in the middle with its quaint customs, backward-looking ideas and a huge amount of money, was inevitably going to cause friction. A man called Frith was particularly vociferous about things that needed to be done as far as the corporation is concerned. And this led to the Great Awakening. So you've had the Great Refusal, you've now got the Great Awakening. People started waking up to actually how much money some of these companies had, though it has to be said, some of them were dormant. I think there was one which had less than 12 members by about the 1850s. Some of them really weren't extant anymore. They existed on paper but sort of didn't really. And as part of the Great Awakening, actually, some companies were not only revitalised and renovated, they were reformed. And, of course, the driving factor behind them was charitable works. And we'll get onto those in a moment. But for those of you who are taking notes, there was a Royal Commission in 1835, which was inconsequential, probably incomprehensible as well. The corporation reforms of the 1850s, and there was an inquiry. I always think this is wonderful. It ran from 1880 to 1884, and I can just imagine the prevarication on the part of the city side, who, when they really don't want to do something, are perfectly eloquent in meetings which will then go on for hours and hours and hours and drive everybody bonkers. And a key thing, of course, was the development of Great Fire. Well, you all know about the Great Fire. Education as an extension of charitable work, and I always put a plug in for City and Guilds, which I think is another absolutely superb development from the livery companies, from the City of London, and I think should be underlined in the present climate because they provide examinations and training in over 500 vocational areas. They do English language as well, so as a linguist, of course, I'm all in favour of them. They cover 28 different sectors of employment, and they are present in over 100 countries. Now, there are only 206 in the United Nations. So if you take out the Cook Islands and Vanuatu, I would imagine that virtually any country which has a training requirement will have a City and Guilds presence somewhere. And the other thing is that they're working extremely hard in the development of apprenticeships, actually getting people into the kind of occupations which are so necessary and where we have a skills shortage and where we do need people who are trained up in the kind of occupations which are needed in all sorts of different parts of the economy. And that really does develop from the fact that the guilds and the livery have maintained a whole range of occupational areas. You think of the farriers, for example, you think of the saddlers, you think of the loriners, and that's just inside the field of horticulture. So they have a purpose, and this is a way in which that can not only be expressed, but also developed. I think that's also very important. Now, yes, there we are. They have international hubs in as far apart as Singapore and Johannesburg. So that's absolutely marvellous. And, of course, today we have the new city academies, the latest government initiative, the free schools. These are opportunities. You've all heard of merchant tailors, haberdashers, asks, etc., etc. And an increasing number of schools are being supported via the City of London. And again, this is an extremely important development. More and more education and training are absolutely at the heart of solving so many of the financial and social problems that we have in this country today. Awards, bursaries and scholarships are widespread, and over £14 million a year are being given away in the support of good causes. Some companies, like the Cutlers, still encourage people to enter a particular trade, like instrument manufacture, and others offer support for particular university departments. I like the Salters, who've reinterpreted themselves to support chemistry departments in universities, and it's astonishing to think of one eminent college in London which shut its chemistry department, Lord knows why. The cloth workers support textiles and dyeing at the University of Leeds, right in the centre of the traditional cloth industry, and there you have departments which are working in areas of research. In fact, it was at Leeds, I had an interesting conversation with a guy about printing and looking at security printing. And we had a very interesting discussion, piece of R&D, about security ink. And what they're trying to work on is when you have documents which people try to falsify by photocopying and then try to pretend they're originals, you usually spot them. But if you have an ink which changes colour when it's photocopied, then you can see at a glance that it's actually a forgery. And that's a particular piece of work which they're doing, which, again, links into the trades of our particular company at the stationers. Now, the Guildhall. They published a useful little leaflet last year, I hope you picked it up, on the 350th anniversary of the foundation of the Royal Society. And it listed the amount of support which the livery companies give to the development of science. Again, we either think of the rather, the historic sort of subjects, or we think of the very specific kind of topics which you get arising safe from the gunsmiths or the goldsmiths, for example. But 28 companies are directly related in science areas, and that makes me wonder whether we could actually have more formal cooperation between sister companies, many of whom, if you go back far enough in medieval times, split away from each other because they were squabbling about something. The livery hasn't always been made up of happy families, but that, I suppose, is inevitable. But if you look at the building trade, for example, if you look at agriculture, if you look at different areas of scientific endeavour, you can actually sort of go through your list, look at the Kennedy book on the livery companies, and you can see that they do actually group together. And perhaps this is another area in which the livery can have a direct impact on training, on trade, and the development of particular economic areas. And again, as I said right at the beginning, I keep on tripping over good news stories, and people sort of mention them to me slightly apologetically and sort of rather quietly. And I always say, well, for God's sake, put this in the Evening Standard so people know what is actually going on. And if you go on the website, if you go onto the fishmonger's website, they've got a link across to all of the other livery companies, so very easy to find. And they will list all the things that they're doing. And again, I think this is something which should be plugged and encouraged. Now, an increasing number of people take the freedom of the City of London. There's a queue of guilds waiting to take the livery. So it makes me wonder, nobody seems to have very much time anymore. Very difficult to get young city workers to get to a Gresham lecture at 6 o'clock because they're not leaving the office till 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock. A very high percentage of the square mile is now involved in 24-hour working, for example. I know young people whose working day starts at 6:30, they're following the international markets. They can be working till very late in the evening, and this is one reason, of course, why you can see the Gresham lectures online. But then, why do people join an organisation which they pay to get into? Thinking about that, actually, the stationers' company, be warned, is the only company you have to pay to get out of. I was at a ceremony yesterday welcoming new liverymen, and right at the end, the underwarden says, "Please to remember the widows and orphans," and you walk past this medieval chest, and there was the occasion, we have some very young freemen, because we link the freedom up to the bursary holders, which we have, and which I'm pleased to say we're increasing. And this poor lass had £2, and of course this large medieval chest resonated as £2 went clonk into the bottom. But of course what we hope is in 15 years' time she'll be managing director of a much larger company, then we can really tap her for money. But there we are. So a rather wonderful man called Connell, they don't make them like this anymore. He had a successful career in medicine, this is early 20th century, a successful career in law, a distinguished military career, which took him from the trenches in France right the way through to Mesopotamia. And he was a company clerk for 25 years. And it's to his credit we have the 5 great points of fellowship, so I don't claim any credit for knowing about them. Charity, citizenship, commerce, comradeship, and conviviality. Now, charity, as I think you will have heard, needs no explanation or justification, although the Charities Commission is becoming much more demanding and even militant in what it defines as charitable work, and the number of foundations, I have to say, let alone flag days, seem to increase year by year. And people's ability to donate must be coming under pressure in the present climate. And again, this is curious, people do donate. We saw this with the tsunami, we see this when there's the latest world disaster, East Africa famine, etc. People are very generous. And joining a company needn't be expensive, but you find that there are things you want to go to, and as you move up in the company, it seems to cost you a little bit more. At the beginning of the year, I had a splendid week. I received no fewer than 4 letters from organisations asking me whether I had considered putting them in my will. So I went rushing round to the doctor to say, do they know something about me that I don't? And really rather flattering, actually. I should be more popular after my death than I am while I'm still walking around, but there we are. So the nice thing is, of course, that these charitable organisations, these charitable activities, do go back into the mists of time. Most companies of the long-established companies have a fund, like good old John Norton, that does go back into the 16th century and before, and these people, I think, provide the inspiration for the way in which we can continue to give, even though, of course, quite often the nature of the giving has to change. Rather nice, the Bishopsgate Foundation, another organisation that's well worth supporting, but please come to our lectures, not theirs. They have all sorts of historic bequests, and rather nice, in the 19th century, people used to leave money for buckets of coal for poor widows, and that's now been turned into subsidies on your gas bill. And needless to say, I've put in for several. Citizenship. Well, the livery is a way of taking an interest in the life and work of the city. Voting for the sheriffs and the mayor I consider to be a privilege and a duty. I'm pleased to say that quite often Common Hall will have 600 or 700 people actually turning up. And again, this is a custom which is rooted in the far distant past, but is still very much alive today. Citizenship, yep, that's right. Commerce, again, we all support trades. And you sometimes think that's a dirty word, but there we are. Difficult time for workers, let alone the workplace. There are pressures on employers, and the livery companies can give moral as well as practical support. I think of the farmers and the gardeners back at the foot and mouth problem in the early part of the decade, wasn't it? And a lot of farmers were having serious problems, and they were being supported by the livery company, regardless as to whether or not they were members. That was part of the trade, part of the industry, and they were in trouble, and there was a way of helping them. Comradeship, well, it's a good word for somebody who was a major in the Royal Army Medical Corps, but there's no contest, really. It is nice. I mean, one nice thing about belonging to a company which is still linked to a trade is you can walk into the hall, you don't necessarily know anybody there, but you know that there's part of the trade which you have an interest in and which they do too. And by the end of the evening, you've gone out with half a dozen business cards and promises to meet people for drinks and I don't know what. And of course, this reinforces the trade in itself. And the other nice thing is that increasingly companies are going out to find the younger members. Time does go on a bit, and you sort of think to yourself, well, I first knew about this company when I was about 35. I'm now slightly over that. And where are the 35-year-olds coming forward now? Where are the young freemen? Where are the young liverymen who, in the fullness of time, will join the court, who will become master, and will become the sort of senior figures in the organisation? And I think attracting people in, not only, of course, putting on activities that they actually want to go to. We've got some young stationers who are now organising activities which the old fogies don't want to go to, but the young people do. And a lot of organisations, they're getting onto Twitters and they're getting onto Facebook, and they're really presenting themselves with a much more modern image than might be the case when you think back to the pictures I showed you of the livery halls. I would actually think that comradeship and these 5 C's, we're going to have a couple more C's. I would add concern. If you're really not interested in anybody else, don't join a livery company, because that really is what it's all about. Your fellow members. Let's go back to medieval times when people looked after their members through the hard times, through hardship, through the plagues of the 17th century, burial societies. Again, I've seen cards from the 17th century where you're requested to attend the funeral of a fellow member, etc., etc. And, of course, to follow up with indigent families or people whose children, for example, were facing hard times as a result of family loss. And then, of course, I suppose in straitened times, we can't mention this, but conviviality, which is a lovely word. There was some embarrassment the other day at quite how many bottles of champagne we got through in the last couple of years, but the argument was it was all in a good cause. And then there was a lengthy and protracted argument about whether we should have French wines or Chilean. And of course I came out firmly in favour of South America to assist the economy of Argentina and Chile. If you look up, Thackeray has a wonderful account of a city dinner. These were in the days when a livery Christmas menu would run to about 24 courses and was started about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and finished by the time the last man was standing. And I think he attends the Worshipful Company of Bellows Menders, and it kind of gets worse from there, but a lovely picture, totally satirical, of course, and not related to reality for one moment. Now, while I'm on the subject of the 3 C's, and I'm not too sure that the clock up there is right, I would have 3 more C's: collegiate, church, and corporation. Collegiate, when I think that City University, when I joined it in 1990, had 4,500 students, and now has 22,000, and it has over 1,600 staff. It's very difficult to get to know anybody. I've never actually managed to memorise more than 10,000 students, and 22,000 goes even beyond my range, and you just can't get to know everybody in the way that you could in a smaller organisation. And that is one nice thing I think about a livery company, that you do belong to an extended family, and you do get to know people very well. You get to know more about what they do, what they've done, and it's got a nice sort of feeling to it. Most of the companies will be linked to a city church. I noticed the church advertising at carol service this morning, and it was a livery church of whichever one it was. And of course, there is a certain amount of formality and ceremonial. By sheer coincidence, the only picture I could find on the internet, we have Stationers' Hall laid out for a banquet on the left-hand side. Our rates are very reasonable. If you want to book the hall, please see me afterwards. And of course, I'm too modest to mention we're the only company to have a garden, which you can see on the right-hand side. And thanks to the generosity of some of the members, we've got a rather nice staircase, which is there, strictly speaking, for purposes of fire and health and safety. But we have an increasing number of weddings, and the happy couple always want to be photographed on this staircase. So it's just a matter to sort of point out to people. And of course, there is this rather nice mixture, I think, of formality, of tradition, and a certain light-hearted approach to it. It's quite nice to see when we have a freedom ceremony or we have new liverymen, you line up behind the beadle, who's a wonderful character, all company beadles are, and there's this shut pair of doors, and the doors swing open, and there's the whole of the court in all its glory, and it looks totally terrifying, and actually everyone's sort of terribly nice to you. And yes, you are carrying 600 years of tradition. Yes, you are now one of the people responsible for at least the next 10 years of it, and of course you want to pass something on in at least as good a condition as you found it, and hopefully better. And I think that's an important thing which actually drives a lot of the membership. Now, important to think, where do we go to? Well, okay, I've mentioned charity, citizenship, commerce, comradeship, and conviviality, plus my extra 3 C's. I'd add two Q's, quaint but not too quirky. People do like a lot of the things which we offer. These are magnificent buildings. Big discussion going on about opening the halls in the weekend of the Queen's Jubilee next June. If not, then I think more halls are planning to join the rather splendid open day that takes place in September. And if you've not been to many of these halls, do please take advantage of that, because they really are worth looking at. But as I've argued in my own company, we mustn't stress history too much. You can spend a lot of time, I've just spent 40 minutes really talking about the past. It's all wonderful stuff, and we can wallow in nostalgia and laugh at Thackeray and all the rest of it. But we do have to think very firmly about actually what direction we're going in. We have to accept the reputation of the city has taken a bashing in the last year or two. Bankers, they rank below highwaymen, pirates, and even members of Parliament in public esteem. Large amounts of cash and capital, whatever regardless of what they represent and how well they're being used, will always attract envious eyes. The average age of liverymen, we have to accept, raises year by year, and the Facebook generation may not look on the companies in the same way as their elders and betters do. But bear in mind that most liverymen can't tweet or Twitter, let alone, I have to read this out, upload apps onto their iPad without assistance from their grandchildren. And it's somehow the iPad generation we've got to get involved, because they are the ones who'll be carrying on the torch from us. So what can we do? How do we actually go around and do it? I'm convinced that sponsorship and support for what I would call the professional and vocational young, people who are entering professions, people who are going into trades, especially the trades of the company, and by young, I probably now mean under 35. We are saddling our children with debt in a way that hasn't happened since the 18th century. I know there are all sorts of ways that the government assures us that £9,000 a year need not be terrifying, but the large increase in university entry in this academic year, I greatly fear will be offset by a fairly significant drop in the next year. And I think we have to bear in mind the costs and look for ways in which we can offer prizes, bursaries, outfitting grants for new students, especially those in professions which have extremely expensive textbooks or which require particular equipment. Everybody needs a good computer. And even one-off payments for the grandchildren of liverymen on graduation, which I think would be rather nice. When I find page 13, I can tell you where we go to next. Where's page 13 gone? Oh, it wasn't very important anyway. Support for wider initiatives. The work of other organisations. These are things which we need to look at. What about training CPD, outplacement? I hate to say it, early retirement courses. It's rather wonderful. There's the Chancellor telling us that we've all got to work till we're in our 70s. And you're lucky these days if you get past 58 before your boss calls you in and has that conversation which starts with, now you're nearly 60, old chap, what would you really like to do? And believe me, these things happen. A lot at the moment is being made of apprenticeships, which I mentioned repeatedly in the hope that there's an industrialist sitting in the audience who will give us £1 million to set up a few more. There is government money available. Department for Business Innovation and Skills puts money into the Skills Funding Agency, and then we have things like the National Apprenticeship Service and a group called ProSkills, which are also playing their part. But again, you can have organisations to encourage something. You need to have a catalyser, you need to have a point of contact which will actually get these opportunities out into the wider world. And I think this is another way in which the livery companies can open themselves out much more into national life. Now, to some extent, this is a continuation of a role that even Sir Richard Whittington would have recognised, financier to King Henry V. There's a wonderful story that he was given an IOU by the King for some phenomenal sum. I think it was £20,000, and he ostentatiously burnt it, firstly to show his loyalty to his king, and secondly because he knew there wasn't a cat's chance in hell of it ever being paid. I think Whittington, think of the Whittington Hospital and lots of other bequests, he would approve of the efforts made by so many companies to support charities, the traditional almshouses, the more contemporary interpretation in the form of support for sheltered housing, for example, or housing associations. Because apart from the pressures of unemployment, the young, and again I would fit that figure at about 35, are having increasingly difficulty with suitable or long-term accommodation. The other traditional role of a company is to sponsor a particular unit of the armed forces. And this might have been ceremonial at some time between World War II and the ventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, but there's an increasing need for support not only for the widows and orphans, but also for this very large number. I think the Ministry of Defence is rather coy about the precise number of ex-soldiers who require prosthetic limbs. And these, I understand, actually need to be refitted and reshaped at regular intervals as the user gets older. And that means that the Afghanistan campaign, the consequences will be with us for the natural lives of those troops. And that is something I think which more than one company has taken seriously. There is support for places like Headley Court, and this is another responsibility which I think can be taken on and channelled very usefully by the livery companies. So let's look forward, let's be positive. Does the livery actually have a role to play in controlling events, or does it even have a place in a world centred on electronic exchanges, off-floor trading and international banking regulation. Is the world of finance after the euro crisis going to look like anything which we possibly know at the present time? Can a practice such as my word is my bond work across international boundaries and cyberspace? At a time when people are thinking about greater external control, is there perhaps still time to think about not just self-regulation, which is currently seriously out of fashion, but an environment where people feel a sense of commitment to the square mile? Why would a company want to put its headquarters in London rather than Frankfurt, Paris, Dubai, New York, Singapore, anywhere of half a dozen different places? Because you can link up so easily by electronic means. How do we make the square mile more attractive, not just as far as the workplace is concerned? City AM this morning had a whole thing about tax regimes for incoming companies, but actually making it a more attractive place for people to come and work in. And let's not forget the work of the City Corporation with looking after Hampstead Heath and Epping Forest and all sorts of other things, as well as that rather nice event in September when they just leave pianos in all parts of the square mile and invite people to go along and play them. So if we can attract the kind of people who will have an influence on the way that the square mile, not the way it's governed, not the way it's managed, but the way in which it thinks, then I think there's a positive role for livery companies to this day. So one way or another, I like to think that the livery movement will be with us for the foreseeable future. Having just said the livery movement, I got told off by a very senior liveryman a little while ago. It's not a movement, but there's an awful lot of people involved in it, and it does in many ways work together. It's up for each generation, really, to ensure that the livery is relevant, it serves a purpose, and it's in a fit state to pass on to the next generation. And there comes a time when we have to let go a bit and say, well, it's their turn, and they have to make of it what they will, and what foundations can we lay to ensure that the companies can be as effective and can have the useful role, which I hope I've persuaded you today that they do have. So in the words of the celebrated livery toast, may they flourish root and branch for ever and ever and ever. Thank you.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.